the Bureau of Jail Management and Penology, the Bureau of Fire Protection, and 10 Coast Guard commanders who are patrolling the South China Sea and the Sulu and Celebes Sea. So during this semester, my student posed to me this question: Professor, how will you handle military-grade laser in the South China Sea? And with all honesty, I gave him my answer: I don't know. Then we go to the second slide. Here is the official photo released by the Philippine Coast Guard on the military-grade laser incident last February 6, 2023. Then we proceed to the next slide. What is the current situation for the Philippines? We have to tackle the Chinese maritime militia. And according to the Asia Maritime Transparency Institute, for a 12-month period ending in September 2022, they have monitored at least an average of 20 Chinese ships near the Iroquois Reef in Palawan. And the presence of these ships resulted in dangerous maneuverings, as well as the incident with respect to the military-grade laser. Now, the Philippine Coast Guard manual does not have any entry on dangerous maneuverings and military-grade laser. So I think that this incident would be a start in updating our manual with respect to incidents in the South China Sea. Now, this question brings me to the outline of my lecture. Okay, what was the Philippine response to the Chinese maritime militia? The Philippines filed 627 diplomatic protests. 388 of those were filed during the Duterte administration. 172 were filed in 2022 under the Marcos administration, and 77 were filed for 2023, and it's still ongoing. The diplomatic protests covered illegal fishing, illegal presence of Chinese vessels, the harassment of fishermen and enforcement agencies, and unauthorized marine scientific research. Then we go to the next slide. That's why I use the acronym LASER. Letter L, the Philippines seeks to leverage maritime assets in the South China Sea. For example, we are in the process of doubling our maritime assets, increasing our vessels, our air assets, and with the help of our allies, Australia, Germany, and Japan, we hope to increase our drones for surveillance in the South China Sea. The second point is accepting maritime security strategic partnerships. And we value the partnerships with ASEAN. For example, we have the Trilateral Cooperation Agreement finalized last 2017 among Indonesia, Philippines, and Malaysia in the Sulu, Sulawesi Seas, or more specifically, the 1 million square kilometer tri-border area between the southern Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, which has been the focus of intensifying defense cooperation in order to stem transnational organized crime and terrorist threats. So the Philippines is open to intensify aspects of the Trilateral Cooperation Agreement, be it in the types of operations being conducted, the number of interactions between the three governments, and even the potential expansion. To consider broadening the Trilateral Cooperation Agreement's membership to include other Southeast Asian countries. The Philippines will continue to help strengthen intelligence sharing to facilitate future surveillance operations and to expedite the deployment of trilateral maritime patrol liaison officers to the designated maritime command centers in Tawau, Malaysia, Tawi-Tawi, the Philippines, and Tarakan, Indonesia. Another way of strengthening our maritime security strategic partnership is our involvement in the Southeast Asia Cooperation and Training, a US-led initiative that aims to enhance maritime security capabilities. It involves scenarios related to maritime domain awareness, maritime interdiction, and crisis response. The Philippines is also excited for the first ever ASEAN Joint Maritime Exercises this coming September. This will lead to better interoperability operations with other ASEAN countries, a better communication and coordination setup, and a deeper intelligence sharing system on evolving maritime security threats. Another mark of high ambition is the participation of the Philippines in the drafting of the Code of Conduct on the South China Sea. Even our Philippine President, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., has called for early conclusion of an effective and substantive Code of Conduct during the 42nd ASEAN Summit in Labuan Bajo, Indonesia. Specifically, President Marcos said, and I quote, "We will continue to urge all to abide by the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea as the Constitution of the Oceans. We must ensure that the South China Sea does not become a nexus for armed conflict. We must avoid the ascendance of a might and an aggressive revision of the international order. In an increasingly volatile world, we require constraints on power contained by the force of the rule of law." End of quote. While I was drafting my lecture for today, what came to my mind is the inspiration of the figure of the architect of Indonesia, President Sukarno, who reflects a person who is a consensus builder and a unifier. If President Sukarno were with us today, he would surely work for the conclusion of the Code of Conduct of the South China Sea. The second point is accepting maritime security strategic partnerships, and I would like to cite our partnership with Singapore. Singapore offers training programs and exchanges that cover areas such as maritime security, naval operations, maritime law enforcement, and maritime intelligence. Another partnership is with Vietnam. The Philippines and Vietnam has a growing partnership in maritime security and information sharing to address challenges such as piracy, maritime terrorism, and illegal fishing. Japan is also active in giving the Philippines donations as well as official development assistance to add another 10 multi-response vessels for maritime patrols in the South China Sea. The United States Coast Guard assists our Philippine Coast Guard by providing U.S. Coast Guard cutters as training platforms for our officers. For this year, the U.S. Coast Guard will train 100 Philippine personnel. And during the first quarter, the U.S. Coast Guard also trained personnel of the Philippine Coast Guard and the Philippine Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources in bilateral operations, professional exchanges, search and rescue and communications exercises, small boat operations, multi-vessel maneuvering, and maritime domain awareness drills while at sea. So for the particular exercise, they implemented the search and rescue exercise, where the three organizations practice searching for a distressed vessel, shipboard firefighting techniques, and recovering and treating persons in the water. Recently, last June 2023, Japanese and Philippine Coast Guard ships also staged law enforcement drills in waters near the South China Sea. Three other close allies include Australia. Australia helps us with maritime patrols and capacity building programs. Germany also helps us by donating Airbus helicopters to enhance our surveillance of the Philippine coastline. France also provides technical assistance, training, and consultancy services focused on joint patrols with Philippine counterparts to secure freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. Then we go to letter S. Seek guidance from ASEAN and extra-regional allies. So just this month, the Philippines passed the Philippine Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act, which aims to prevent arbitrary international passage in the Philippine archipelago. The law provides the coordinates designating the sea lanes and air routes suitable for the continuous and expeditious passage of foreign ships and aircraft through or over its archipelagic water and the adjacent territorial sea. Then we go to letter E, exert efforts in capacity building and intelligence sharing, focusing on soft diplomacy. So the Philippines joins the Balikatan exercises, the Southeast Asian, the Kaagapay exercise, which also just happened this month, and also the SICAT exercises. So through the joint maritime patrols that the Philippines does with our allies, our Philippine Coast Guard is able to enhance its capacity for maritime law enforcement. Capacity building continues. We are sending 100 Coast Guards personnel to Japan, 100 to the United States, and another 100 to Australia. So this capacity building is aimed at increasing the competence of our Coast Guard personnel in carrying out their law enforcement capabilities, as well as ensuring the integrity of the territorial waters of the Philippines. Finally, letter R, review bilateral, multilateral arrangements in the South China Sea. And here, the Philippine Coast Guard focuses on deterring irregular, unreported, and unregulated fishing. The Philippines loses $1.6 billion annually to irregular, unreported, and unregulated fishing. The second point is the Philippine Coast Guard also needs help in addressing environmental and marine pollution. So we have had several oil spills the past few months. For example, last March 22, 2023, there was a large oil spill from an industrial oil tanker. There were a total of 800,000 liters of oil in Oriental Mindoro. And we were helped by the US Coast Guard in cleaning up the oil spill. We were also helped with $284 million from the insurance company of the oil tanker. In 2013, 500,000 liters of oil were spilled in Manila Bay, and in 2006, a large tanker sank in Guimaras Island, spilling 109,000 gallons of oil in the island. We will need ASEAN cooperation with respect to marine pollution, specifically oil spill. We need to increase our capacity building for oil spill rescue specialists in this particular region. The Philippines also commits itself to a free and open Indo-Pacific. We respect freedom of navigation, and we hope to achieve that together with our allies. And another important point is cooperation in humanitarian action and disaster response in the region. The Philippines is visited by 27 typhoons annually. Therefore, we need the help of our allies in order to carry out a more responsive and a more dedicated assistance to the victims of these typhoons. The Philippine Coast Guard also placed navigational buoys last May 14, 2023 in the areas of Patag Island, Balagtas Reef, Cota Island, Panata Island, and the Juan Felipe Reef. So these the buoys are adorned with the Philippine flag, signifying the country's sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the exclusive economic zone. And then I go to my conclusion. The next slide. Again, I would like to bring about the figure of President Sukarno, the architect of Indonesia and the proclamator of independence. He wrote, "Reach your ambition as high as the skies. Dream it as high as the skies. Because if you fall, you're going to fall among the stars." The Philippines values its maritime strategic security partnerships with the ASEAN, as well as its engagement with extra-regional partners, knowing well that its fate with its defense allies are inextricably intertwined. The government's approach to region-specific maritime security challenges is measured and prudent, ranging from diplomacy to defense consultation, workforce training, joint exercises, joint patrols, and acquisition and procurement of maritime assets. In sum, the Philippines advocates regional cooperation and soft diplomacy to foster a stable and prosperous maritime future. Thank you, and a pleasant good morning.
Thank you, Professor Amparo, for your interesting presentation. I believe this will enrich our discussion today. If I may summarize, Professor Amparo, that again promoted the primary agency with the lesser concept. That's the task for the Philippine Coast Guard to recognize that the task primarily with the enforcing law, with the conducting maritime security operation, safeguarding life and property at sea, and protecting marine environment and resources. So the last but not least, this is the third speaker, is Ms. Jen Chan Gitjan. Please.
Can you hear me? Very good. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson, for the very kind introduction. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, very good morning, one and all. First, a quick word of thanks to the organizer, especially to Governor of Lemhanas, Bapak Anti Wijayanto, for the very generous invitation, and also to the entire Lemhanas team, Ibu Reni and your team. Thank you very much for the warm hospitality. A real privilege to be here attending this gathering of experts and friends to share my thoughts and hopefully to learn from the experts and to have a good discussion after this. given the limited time that we have today, I plan to just share some broad perspective on the theme of this particular session, to distill some of the current debates, both in the literature and also, in the track 2 discussion in the region right now, in thinking through some of these vexing issues, in a way, in maritime Southeast Asia. So first, to go broad, to ask, what is the most worrying trend in the region, in Southeast Asia? Second, to dwell a little bit deeper into the regional context, and again, to ask, is there a common vision on what the Southeast Asian maritime future should look like? And from there, my third point, and I will dwell and try to talk a little bit about partnerships. And if there's some time, Madam Chairperson, I will want to comment a little bit on the ASEAN Maritime Outlook, which Indonesia has proposed, and to talk a bit about how it is potentially a tool for Southeast Asia to engage external partners on maritime issues in Southeast Asia. So on to my first point. What is the most worrying trend, in my mind at least, and in the discussion that I've had recently when thinking about maritime Southeast Asia? I've long assumed, perhaps naively, that all maritime stakeholders agree on the 3 following propositions. Number 1, our aspiration for peace at sea can only be achieved if we have international rule of law. Number 2, in the maritime domain, the legal order is contained, amongst other things, UNCLOS, and we must therefore protect UNCLOS and not undermine it. And 3, in the event of a dispute between states on the interpretation and application of UNCLOS, the dispute should be resolved peacefully in accordance with international law, or as Dato' Sabrin mentioned, right, if the dispute cannot be resolved by negotiation, the party should agree to refer the dispute to a binding third-party mechanism. So what's the concern here? On the first point, on placing our aspiration for peace, safety, and security on international rule of law, I question, and I do worry, about whether there is still such a consensus. And I'll come back to this point when I discuss about a common vision or a common outlook, or the lack of, in this region. Second, on the need to protect UNCLOS and not to undermine it. And this is perhaps where I'm often quite confused, right, by a lot of the current discussion and the different position being taken, hearing calls from regional partners, friends, even regional countries, who on the one hand talk about upholding the rule of law, on the other hand calling for the amendment of UNCLOS. So I often wonder whether there is a conflict here, whether a unilateral call to amend UNCLOS or to sideline its importance is in itself challenging international law. So of course we are very familiar with the long-held argument that if we open up the prospect for amending UNCLOS, we may never reach a consensus to finalize the convention ever again. No doubt, and don't get me wrong, the effectiveness of UNCLOS is often up for debate in this region, and its provisions still a source of contention between states, even in Southeast Asia. There are many examples of non-compliances by many countries within the region, outside of the region. For example, users and abusers of Strait baselines, perceived illegal restrictions on freedom of navigation by coastal states, and the reluctance to acknowledge the rights and duties of the user states in exclusive economic zones. So one could argue that the current US-China tension has magnified the differences in the interpretation and application of international law. And we see tension between the interests of the coastal state on the one hand and those of major maritime power on the other. So the underlying tension, in a way, from the ambiguity and the different interpretation of vital provision of UNCLOS remains unresolved. So third, on being ready to utilize the dispute settlement mechanism. And this third proposition is perhaps, whilst we have seen some very good example in Southeast Asia where neighbors actually bring their dispute and disagreement to dispute resolutions, there is still a lot of reluctance, right, amongst major maritime powers to utilize this particular mechanism. So in my mind, if these concerns are left unaddressed, will we be faced with a crisis in this region? Or to take it down a notch, what are the risks at hand? Will it increase the risk of an incident and accident at sea, which Pak Rizal spoke about yesterday? How about the risk of an open conflict between the claimants in the South China Sea, or a risk of open military conflict between the great powers, and the risk of irreversible environmental degradation and the correlating food security issues, right? On this point on environment, especially food, in particular fish, I would argue that we are already verging on the crisis stage, but I know many would disagree with me. So in my mind, this talk about crisis, right, meant that's all of the risk management mechanisms and safeguard that we are talking about, we have been talking about, still talking about, have failed one way or another. And hence, we have a crisis at hand. So for discussion purposes in a platform like that, let's assume worst case scenario, where all the prerequisites for effective risk management do not exist anymore. So what am I talking about here? Trust for one, non-existence. How about the platform or institutions that we have, dysfunctional, and zero information sharing? Let's just assume that these three criteria are there. But if we are agreeing, and if we can agree that we are really not quite there yet, then can we focus on working on these three elements, right? Trust, institution, info sharing, to better manage the subject at hand, which, is incidentally the theme of this particular conference as well. So now to dwell a little bit more into the Southeast Asian context, we all know that regional maritime security depends partly on global development and partly on local ones specific to Southeast Asia. It is axiomatic now that an inclusive maritime region founded on international rules and norms lay the foundation for safe and secure seas and is crucial for regional continued development and prosperity. And again, we heard a lot of these being narrated and debated and discussed yesterday. But even as friends and partners all emphasize on the importance of maintaining a rules-based maritime order, in my view, it is rather clear that there is still no common vision on what the maritime Southeast Asian maritime future should look like. The lack of a common vision meant that there's no alignment of priorities, even less on policy and strategy, right? So those with a vision of a competitive one will insist that the current strategic environment is a zero-sum game and is currently dominated by great power competition and rivalry. So even if extra-regional powers and partners extend their interest to cooperate with Southeast Asia, many are concerned or have reservations because this could potentially create more complexity to ongoing Sino-US rivalry. Challenges to traditional freedoms of the seas arising from jurisdictional disputes about who owns what, over jurisdictional obligation of the coastal states versus the duties and rights of the user states, about environmental concern, and broadly the lax observations of laws, rules, and principles. We see nation-state forgetting that UNCLOS was a product of a grand bargain, one that was forged through very difficult compromises which we may not achieve again. So preserving the right of military users of the sea is one such grand bargain, threaded through the various maritime zones and the correlating passage regimes. And the provisions of the maritime zones were drafted in a way to ensure that major sea lanes remain open to naval vessels on top of the commercial ones. Of specific interest to Southeast Asia, of course, would be the exclusive economic zone, the straits used for international navigation, and archipelagic sea lanes. In this vision of the world, we can expect very little cooperation and a rather high risk of fractured regional institutions and that of conflict. Conversely, there is also a vision of a cooperative nature, reminding us that the success of our region depends on the seaborne trade and the globalized system that it leads to. Of course, still acknowledging that this particular system is currently under threat, and it's not just because of great power competition. Examples include the damaging effect of the various maritime threats, which we saw a very long list yesterday. These threats are well known, and the frequently raised questions and recommendations of what we need to do. I think, this crowd will know them by heart. That being said, apart from just recognizing how important maritime security is in nearly all countries, balancing commitments and resources is getting more and more difficult, especially when we are slowly recovering from the global pandemic. So priorities matters. On top of that, the question do remain whether cooperation on some of these maritime security issues, what we call common interests, will lead to a spillover effect and to help alleviate the trust deficit in the region that is much talked about and arguably one of the leading cause for increased risk of conflict at sea. One thing we learned from COVID-19 thus far, at least in the maritime domain, would be that the multilateral cooperation is essential, right? But Rizal spoke a lot about how major global trends continue to reshape the maritime strategic environment and the regional outlook, so to speak. And this geopolitical uncertainty should give new impetus to ASEAN to cooperate with partners and friends. So now a few words on cooperation and the institution in Southeast Asia. I think one key criteria for us to move forward and towards positive cooperation and engagement in the region is the need to be flexible. And one such aspect is to have various models, as we do in Southeast Asia. Understanding partners' priorities, ability, and constraints is vital. Some question to this will be, do we understand each other well enough? Do we understand our partners? Do our partners understand us well enough? Are we being flexible and accommodating? Are we being inclusive? So in a way, is the ASEAN and ASEAN-led mechanism sufficient and effective, right? That would have been the next question as well. We often consider in this region, whether when tackling a particular threat or challenges, the initiative ought to be ASEAN-wide, all 10 ASEAN, or can a sub-regional approach be adopted? So whether the ASEAN minus X approach is appropriate, right? And we have good examples of that. Both Dato' Sabarin and Professor Mimi spoke about, the Malacca Straits Patrol, the TCA agreement, both going on very well without side effect on ASEAN as an institution itself. We also have a very good example of ASEAN Plus approach, and in this, I have in mind the Information Fusion Center in Singapore, where not just the ASEAN, all 10 of ASEAN member states are partner of, we have many extra-regional partners being, part of the IFC. Yesterday, we heard that a key feature built into the current ASEAN-led regional architecture is that it is one that is open and inclusive, where no single state's influence is exclusive, so to speak. Not China, not the US. So these various regional groupings provide inclusive platforms for ASEAN to engage its partners and extra-regional powers. Of course, we have seen commentators, especially regional commentators, say that the Quad, for example, is perceived to focus too much on excluding China, then further integrating China into the regional framework which ASEAN is trying to do. While many in Southeast Asia do share the Quad's anxiety about China and see the US as the resident power in the region, ASEAN states still need to be very mindful of the robust and pragmatic relation with China that each one of the Southeast Asian states has painstakingly nurtured, right? And we all know how difficult that can be sometimes. We also heard yesterday that since the region cannot exclude any of these great powers, the best strategy is to engage them all. The fact that China is at Southeast Asian doorstep, the proximity and the correlating social, cultural, and economic ties are links that cannot be decoupled. Of course, there are issues, right, arising from these links, not to mention the unresolved maritime disputes China has with its neighbors. But in a way, we could also say that, while we do not have good fences and therefore we are not good neighbors now, it doesn't mean that ASEAN and China cannot mend those fences in the future. So one of the latest tools in the ASEAN toolkit that is going to come online very, very soon will be the ASEAN Maritime Outlook. The AMO, in my mind, if it can clearly outline ASEAN maritime priorities, it has a chance at creating a common maritime agenda which will become more apparent. And this is going to be important because it will help accentuate maritime cooperation between ASEAN and our extra-regional partners, including multilateral organizations, right? The concept paper that's already that's already out there has developed and outlined how an ASEAN maritime outlook could be formulated under Indonesian chairmanship for now. Yeah, and it refers to the AOIP quite a bit, and the document itself set out and advanced some of the priorities that the AOIP has already laid out. But I'm sure we are all aware that even the AOIP has received very strong criticism as to its practical value, usually pointing to the lack of deliverables and tangible outcome. So supporters of the AOIP, myself included, will usually say that the critics misinterpreted, right, the purpose and intent of the AOIP. The AOIP was never meant to be a strategy to guide ASEAN through this intricacy of great power rivalry, but rather to establish, avenues for cooperation. So in my mind, the same expectation should be have of the AMO, right? In a sense that, I really felt that it was very prudent of ASEAN on the first instance to not set it out as a common ASEAN maritime strategy, so to speak, yeah? We all know that the ASEAN broad maritime perspective comes from differing maritime priorities. The 10, soon to be 11 ASEAN member states has very specific issues that needs to be tackled, and there are very few issues, even though we have a long list of ASEAN maritime priorities, very few of these issues can mobilize a whole of ASEAN action, so to speak. For example, the territorial and maritime dispute in the South China Sea are a priority to few member states, and particularly the claimants. The problems of illegal migration in the Andaman Sea is currently being managed by the littorals. So it's very unlikely for the AMO to introduce new mechanisms or platforms to carry out its intended purposes, since there are already existing, maritime related mechanisms within the ASEAN and ASEAN-led processes. But we will still need, right, a platform, a mechanism to push forward the AMO agenda where it actually, get distilled. So in my mind, and this is a very humble suggestion, is perhaps, the ASEAN Maritime Forum and the extended ASEAN Maritime Forum might be one of such platform, and it will also give a reason to reinvigorate both the AMF and the EMF. So I will end my remarks here, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. James. This is very deep, thoughtful, and also insightful statement. So if I may recall your statement is we have to promote common principle in advancing maritime cooperation in various sectors in accordance with the norms and standards enshrined in the international law, included on Clause 1982, as well as ASEAN shared values of inclusivity, transparency, mutual respect, and mutual trust. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, now it's time to invite your comment, question, and thoughts to share any ideas of this discussion. So I'll open the floor. Maybe Tri first in the first session. Would you please mention your name and your institution, and to whom your question to direct? Please, the question and answer session is open. As the gentleman behind. Bisa tolong mic-nya.
Thank you so much indeed for this opportunity. Appreciated to those keynote speaker and also presentation. Of course, it will enlighten our perspective and also amplify our ideas. Thank you so much indeed. I am Major General Budi Pramono. First of all, I would like to raise my question to Profesor Amparo. Maraming salamat po. Maraming salamat for quoting my president. Pasensya na po kayo kung ako nga'y nakamali. Ipinakmakmalaki kung kayong lahat, Professor. Professor, I think from your idea dealing with your leisure, you really actively contribute to the 7 ASEAN outlooks. Appreciate it. However, on the other hand, you mentioned, given to the conflict or current event in Palawan Island, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, you mentioned that there are much more Chinese militia. In this case, so this conflict trigger your idea to empower your army, strengthen your air force, and also enlighten your navy. My question is, Professor, I think this one very contradictory. In one hand, you mentioned about leisure, but on the other hand, you also raise the armed proliferation. You also build the arm race over there. So it will contradict much to the 7 ASEAN outlook. Would you mind to scrutinize a little bit for that? And the second one to the Professor Sabah dari Malaysia, from Malaysia.
Dr. Sabirin, Dr. Sabirin.
Dr. Sabirin, you mentioned about Sulu Island, the importance of the Sulu Islands, Sulawesi Island, and you mentioned also it will, what you call it, joint petrol or whatever the terminology among Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia. I think you are very optimist people, optimist person. From my perception, I really little bit pessimist to see and to observe and also analyze for that combined or joint activity to anticipate Sulu Island and Sulawesi Island. Because come to the interest, come to the national interest, even vital interest, important interest, marginal interest, survival interest, I do believe that those countries will have different interests. So my question is, how can you anticipate those vulnerability if we really make it what's called combined activity or joint petrol or whatever the terminology is, to anticipate the problem in the future for the Sulu and Sulawesi Island. And the last one, to the keynote speech from Singapore. Madam, many people said about what is actually the usefulness of laws. What is actually the certainty that we got from enforce the laws. And also what is actually the justice that we get it when we are talking about laws. And your presentation said about UNCLOS. For your own perception, Singaporean perception, what is actually the justice that you got it? What is actually the usefulness that you got it? What is actually the certainty that you got it from UNCLOS? Moderator, thank you so much indeed for this opportunity. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for that question. I would like to address the first question with respect to the seeming contradictory nature of the modernization of the armed forces and the peaceful conduct in the South China Sea. in my lecture, I focused more on the Philippine Coast Guard and the role, the maritime law enforcement capabilities of the Philippine Coast Guard. So specifically in the South China Sea, for this particular situation, crisis situation of the Chinese maritime militia, the Philippines applied soft diplomacy in the form of filing more than 362 diplomatic protests. So the Philippines applies the peaceful way of settling disputes. And with respect to the modernization of the Philippine Coast Guard, the aim is primarily to strengthen its maritime law enforcement operations, particularly in focusing on irregular, unregulated, and unreported fishing, and also in the area of maritime pollution, because that falls under the mandate of the Philippine Coast Guard, as well as the promotion of freedom of navigation to promote trade and commerce in our territorial waters, and lastly, the one of promoting humanitarian action and disaster response. So all this capability building is focused on enhancing search and rescue, addressing marine pollution, addressing IUU fishing, as well as humanitarian and disaster response. So we are not really focused more on the military solution to the conflict, but we are looking at the most peaceful way to address the rising tensions in the South China Sea. Thank you.
Yes, Dato, for the second question.
Thank you, Attorney. Thank you, General, for your question and your concern as well. I'm an optimist. I appreciate your experience on the ground, seeing that there are a lot of conflicts happening. It's not easy to manage the area, bordering 3 countries at least. But I touched about the arrangement of the superpowers 200 years ago. And imagine that time and what happened now. And even during negotiation for UNCLOS 3 for 14 years, and how we got that and how we deal with that, it takes years and years. We have to be optimists. We all do our work. I mentioned about this Sulawesi and Sulu Sea as an alternative to this Straits of Malacca and South China Sea, because see the potential of growth. This history about conflict is nothing but economic in nature. People want to have better living, constant supply of food, resources, or whatever. And I think with BIM IAGA, this Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, East Asia growth area, and now I project that optimistically that if with the shifting of capital of Indonesia to Nusantara, it will sometimes alter this status quo. People focusing something about growth, economics, and with that they have to protect that. Then you see, I think there will be more active discussion and activities to protect that interest. Like I said that I quoted the issue of the Mindanao arrangement. Started with 3 countries and then joined by Japan, by Norway, and other countries as well. It is probably an example how actually we resolve these issues among ourselves. So we have to be optimistic, because with ASEAN since 1967 now, we managed to resolve all issues, I think, amicably. Where probably some rhetoric here and there, but the leaders of ASEAN since the formation, they are all level-headed and they know the interests, and we know the sensitivity. We respect each other. I think this ASEAN core values, I think, is something we should appreciate. And I'm confident that with level of education, rising among the population and the interest of trade, from countries outside ASEAN, depending on ASEAN. I think this, if we can exploit it proper, we can make ASEAN a really good area. Recently, I had an opportunity to have a research in Pulau Sipadan and Ligitan, a beautiful island. And we see that what the saddest thing is that you see these marine litters not controlled. How actually the heaven, the so beautiful islands, you see a lot of plastics thrown to the sea. And I think the same problem happened, I think, in Indonesia and in Philippines as well. So I think this could be other areas in which, apart from the conflict, we can cooperate in having this, as a protecting the environment, which is, I think, good things, protecting the sea resources, the turtles, the fishes, the beautiful island. I think if we can work together, I think probably we can forget about the conflicts of territory and security. Thank you, that's my answer.
Thank you, Datuk Sun. The third question.
Thank you very much, Major General, for that very important question. In fact, it's one that I constantly have to remind my student at the Command and Staff College as well. If I can illustrate my answers by pointing to the characteristic of Singapore as a very, very small state, right? So I want to talk to this in two what I call Singaporean identity. Number one, as a small state. Number two, as an island state. So unlike Indonesia, which is one of the largest countries in the world, Singapore, as a small state, has a fundamental interest in the peaceful settlement of international disputes in accordance with international law and its sanctioned processes, not on the basis that might is right. As an island state, hemmed in by very, very big neighbors, right, Singapore needs to rely on international law, including UNCLOS, to ensure freedom of navigation and overflight, and to ensure that the interpretation and application of these provisions remain consistent. Imagine, for us Singaporeans to get out of Singapore, we need to either fly through somebody else's airspace or sail through somebody else's water. And these freedom of navigation and overflight is provided through international law, including UNCLOS. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jane. Any further comments, Chandra, before I invite another participants? All right. Okay, now I would like to invite second question. Yes, the lady in the front. Mohon mic-nya. Terima kasih.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm Chuping from Malaysia. So my question is to all panelists about your assessment on the Naval Coast Guard cooperation in Southeast Asia. So Indonesia.
May I know your name and also your institution, please?
Oh yes, I'm Chuping Hu from National University of Malaysia, UKM. And my question is to all the panelists about your assessment on your respective countries' Naval Coast Guard cooperation and how this Naval Coast Guard nexus can improve maritime security in Southeast Asia. Thank you.
I think about the Coast Guard and everything related to maritime security. So Professor Amparo or Datu Sabirin? Okay.
I'm not a military person, so doctor asked about Malaysian state of affairs nowadays. I think it is well known. You see on the media, on the newspapers, we mentioned about this thing. But as such has been the probably biggest concern of all the states, for Straits of Malacca and South China Sea. It depends very much on the country economy, and that I said it's not cheap, things like that. But I think one thing for sure, thing can be resolved. You can have joint exercise, which is being done quite often now. So I think all players, all countries understand each other's limitations, and they would like to overcome it by cooperation. I think this is very important. And then we have a lot of cooperation before for the Petrol States of Malacca, and now we have exercises of China Sea, I think that could be the answer to this concern about assets and military procurement. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Amparo. Any perspective from your side?
Okay, with respect to the naval and Coast Guard operations of the Philippines, I would say that there is perfect interoperability between the two distinct organizations. And most of the capacity building training that our Navy personnel and Coast Guard personnel undertake abroad is really for purposes of response, having the appropriate response to disaster and disaster risk response, as well as law enforcement with respect to irregular, unreported, and unregulated fishing. The focus is on non-aggression. We are just focusing on the defense of our territorial waters. Thank you.
Thank you,
Jen,
Dr.
yes.
Hu. Thank you, Dr. Hu, for the very important question as well. I'll take this question in three dimensions. First, of course, you asked about our own country. In Singapore, as I mentioned in my last answer to the last question, Singapore is a very, very small country with very limited waters and also very limited resources. So naturally, both the Navy and our Coast Guard work together seamlessly, just like the Philippines. But on top of that, there are other maritime agencies that have maritime jurisdiction as well, right? Our civil defense have certain functions when it comes to, fire at sea, incidents at sea. Our Maritime Port Authority is in charge of, maintaining safety and environmental protection within the Singapore Strait. So all maritime-related agencies work together very, very well. So to talk about how Singapore cooperate with regional countries, and this is where, we have to highlight the jurisdictions of each of these agencies. Unlike some regional countries, our Coast Guard only have jurisdiction within territorial waters. And this is where, you see Singapore having a bit of problem, joining the ASEAN Coast Guard Forum. In a way, we are parties to it already, but thinking about what our Coast Guard can do and its function is highly limited because of, restrictions to the jurisdiction that our Coast Guard have. But still, we are trying to find ways to get around it, to ensure that, Singapore is at the table of an ASEAN initiative. Most recently, in Singapore, we hosted the International Maritime Security Conference in early May in conjunction with IMDEX Asia. This conference is biannual. It was the 8th iteration this year in May, and it's the first time we have one dedicated panel featuring senior commanders from Coast Guards in the region. Both the commander from Bakamla and MMEA spoke at this event, highlighting, how there's a real recognition on the important role that Coast Guard and maritime law enforcement agency play in regional waters when it comes to ensuring safety, security of regional waters. Yeah, and also if we think about the Information Fusion Center, when it was first started, it only brought about conventional partners, i.e., only navies were part of it. Today, I believe we already have at least 3 liaison officers from the Coast Guard. Philippines was the first one who sent a Philippine Coast Guard liaison officer to Singapore to be part of this setup. Then the US has a Coast Guard liaison officer there. Most recently, Korean Coast Guard has a liaison officer in Singapore, and I believe that Bakamla is already actively and sending very positive vibe that they are going to send a liaison officers to the IFC as well. I think this in combination reminds us that, all agencies, Navy or, the civilian enforcement agencies all have a very important role to play in regional waters. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jen. Now I open the floor for the third participants. Yes, the gentleman I know so many participants interested in your presentation. The middle, gentleman in the middle.
Okay, thank you. My name is Real Admiral Tokyo Tabarat from the National Defense Council. I would like to, first of all, I would like to emphasize our theme of the forum today, which is Asian Future Addressing the Region Geomaritime Rift. And this morning we already discussed many area from Malacca Strait to South China Sea as well as Sulu. So my question is for the all speaker, what is your opinion as well as maybe from your country perception for the VII, free and open Indo-Pacific, as well as maybe from what do you think that the ASEAN should do for that? And then in particular for Professor Amparo Pamela Febe, would you like give us more information that how far that the archipelagic Chilean passage Philippines that already managed or already conducted? Thank you very much.
And the first is Oke, Bapak bisa diulang yang pertanyaan pertama karena menyangkut dengan apakah terkait dengan manajemen dari konflik South China Sea kepada seluruh narasumber?
No, I said that first of all, I emphasize that our theme for this forum is ASEAN Future addressing the regions and geomaritime rifts. And then we already discussed many areas from Malacca to the South China Sea as well as to the Sulu. And then my question is very simple because one of the speakers talked about the VII, which is the free and open Indo-Pacific. So I just ask for all the speakers, what is your view from both your view or maybe from your country's view for that VIBs, as well as what do you think that ASEAN should do for those sort of things? And then for the speaker from Philippines, I would like to asking about what the arrangement for the archipelagic Chilean passage that the Philippines already do so far. Thank you. Do I make myself clear?
Yes, crystal clear. Thank you. Maybe Dato would like to give any comment about the VII and your Malaysian perspective on that, how to resolve on the conflict related to this and a part of the ASEAN member state. What is your perspective on that? Malaysian perspective.
Thank you, Dr. Adrani, and thank you, Dr. Speaker. The topic is about the addressing the region geo-maritime reefs. I have touched this during my presentation that reefs happen every time. We come up with a lot of solutions, bilateral, trilateral, multilateral agreement, arrangement, as well as having a lot of discussion through diplomatic channel to resolve a lot of issues. But I was focusing more towards what will happen in the future, how should we deal with it, looking back at history. This is my focus. I think if we deal too much detail on things, like sovereignty is very important, no doubt about it. It's very important for each country, but there are other pressing issues, I think, which could transcend this. Like I mentioned about the issue of maintaining environment, these marine litters. Probably I can add some more like training. You go towards about providing courses for our fleets of vessels, which is important not only for militarily but some other countries. Like now we know that we have issues that Philippines and Indonesia provide the largest seafarers in the world, and that BIMCO recently mentioned about the issue of integrity. Now we have to upskill the seafarers. I think this is the issue, which transcends the issue of reefs. You help each other because we are providing and helping the world shipping to progress and to be more effective, I think. So this area in which, apart from the environment, I think there are many other things which are very important for us that we can probably forget a bit about issue of sovereignty and territorial claims and conflicts. So the reefs can be, sometime the reef can be healed by avoiding it and focusing on other areas which is equally important for our livelihood. Thank you.
Professor Amparo, maybe you can answer the first and then continue by the second one.
Thank you. Okay, answering the first question on freedom of navigation, the Philippines would like to really push for freedom of navigation. This is based on our experience of having 200 Chinese maritime militia ships blocking the Filipino fishermen. So what was the effect of these maritime militia? They were able to block our fishermen from securing their livelihood. That's why we really push for freedom of navigation. Now, for the second question, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea refers to the state having regard to the safety of navigation may require foreign ships exercising the right of innocent passage through its territorial sea to use sea lanes and traffic separation schemes for the regulation of the passage of ships. So this law was just passed last May, and we are still waiting for the Senate version and also for the implementing rules and regulations. So for the specifics of the Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act, this will take about 2 more months for the implementing rules and regulations, where the Congress will prescribe the sea lanes and air routes suitable for the passage of foreign ships. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Now, Ms. James.
Admiral, if I got your question correctly, you were asking about the U.S. free and open Indo-Pacific and the correlating, increasingly number of Indo-Pacific outlooks that we have heard, some extra-regional countries have been sharing and, perception from the region. I think up to today, after seeing so many versions of the various Indo-Pacific, there's still a debate, at least from the academic and research perspective, still a debate whether these are strategies, are they concepts, are they outlooks, and that what are the expectations on regional country in terms of responding. So in a way, I would argue, and I did mention this a little bit when it comes to the AOIP, is ASEAN way of responding to these various versions of the Indo-Pacific concepts, so to speak. If I adopt one word, right, I would say concepts. Don't get me wrong, is that, if we look at all these various, versions of thinking of various countries in terms of their priorities, a lot of them, they share their priorities with us. When it comes to the Indo-Pacific, a lot of them share, avenues for cooperation, etc., etc. In fact, a lot of the key tenets in some of these concepts and outlooks are areas where, most Southeast Asian countries can agree to, right? Most of them spoke about freedom of navigation. Most of them spoke about importance of SLOC. They talk about, importance of info sharing, capacity building. All these various tenets are important to the region. But the fact that we cannot, and there's no clear indication of what these are, and the expectation from regional countries, that, in my mind, is what led to the AOIP. I think you might remember, Admiral, as well, in that there was bickering, amongst ASEAN member states when negotiating the AOIP as well, when drafting the AOIP, and how we end up with putting the word outlook as ASEAN outlook rather than the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook, the word outlook. I was told, at least, that it's not semantics, right? This is a message from Southeast Asian countries to say that, sure, we've read, your various version of outlook, concept, strategy. We understand that how this is important to us, and we have similar, interests. But ASEAN will use our own pace, our own method in thinking through about this new Indo-Pacific concept, so to speak? I hope I answered your question, Emerald. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jim. I think, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, we have time constraints, so we have to conclude this morning session. But I would like to highlight there are some key statements from the morning session. One, a strong strategic partnership in the maritime domain could greatly contribute to the stability of the Indo-Pacific region. There is still a lot of potential for developing a strategic partnerships with respect to maritime security in the Indo-Pacific, despite the presence of bilateral frameworks, the need to operationalize the partnership through consistent interaction and constant improvement. Moreover, other areas of maritime cooperation must also be explored, including domain awareness, interoperability, information sharing, and maritime law enforcement. However, due to the shift of the global geopolitical landscape and major power country burgeoning assertive naval activities in various parts of the Indo-Pacific, we have to significantly reorient the individual or national policies toward regional maritime security. And the last, the country with the same vision of maritime security will share a host of concerns and could potentially act an anchor of the regional maritime security order. All right, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, let us give a big applause to the speakers. Thank you for your distinguished speaker for the very interesting and important presentation. All of the points discussed are critical and essential steps to empower strategic partnerships in managing maritime security in the region. Thank you. The discussion is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the interactive discussion, ma'am and sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, once again, please give a round of applause to our moderator and speakers for session 1.
Next, we would like to present Momento to the session 1 speakers and moderator, then followed by a group photo. May we kindly invite to the stage Prime Secretary of Lemhanas, Deputy for Strategic Studies of Lemhanas and Chief of the 7th Jakarta Geopolitical Forum 2023.
Ladies and gentlemen, the first memento will be given to our speaker, Datuk Dr. Sabirin bin Jafar, Adjunct Professor University Kebangsaan Malaysia.
And for the second memento will be given to Professor Ampero Pamela Vabe from the Philippines.
For our third memento will be given to our speaker, Dr. Jane Chan Gitian from Singapore. Thank you very much, sir.
And last but not least, the last memento will be given to Dr. Adriani Kusumawardani as the moderator for today's session.
Ladies and gentlemen, please kindly take your place to have a group photo session. Allow me to guide for the photo session. I will count down from 3 to 1. 3, 2, 1.
Share your best smile, everyone. Great.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. You may now return to your seat. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our first session of the 7th Jakarta Geopolitical Forum 2023. Thank you, distinguished guests. Ladies and gentlemen, next we will be having our second session, Southeast Asia Nuclear Free Weapon Zone. After a coffee break for 15 minutes outside the room, in the VVIP room, and in the VIP room, and in the lobby of Flores Ballroom, and we will see you back again at 10:15 a.m.
We hope that you could come to this room 5 minutes earlier at 10:10 a.m. Thank you very much for your cooperation and see you at session 2.
apa? Ya.